Hello, welcome to Diecast Diaries. I'm Dan, and this is a video I've been looking forward to doing ever since I launched my channel about 3 months ago. It's a review of the Matchbox Battle Kings range that came out between 1974 and 1981. Matchbox Battle Kings always been one of my favourites of all the different military ranges. I think it must have been a pretty successful range for Matchbox. There were 2 separate lots of models that they released as part of the range. First one came out between 1974 and 1977. It consisted of 10 models, 8 of which were unique to the range, but all of which were kind of tended to be done in quite unrealistic metallic type colour schemes. And then the second part of the range came out between 1978 and 1981, and that consisted of the original 10 models, but now done in far more realistic military colours, and 8 new models, 4 of which again were unique to the range. So there are actually a total of 28 models that I've got here. Now, as I thought that would be probably too much to do in one video, what I'm going to do is split this review into 2 parts. So the first one's going to concentrate on the initial 10 models plus the re-release versions of those 10. And then in part 2, I'll have a look at the remaining 8 models, plus I'll also have a look at what happened to some of the Battle Kings castings after Matchbox had finished with them. Now, most of the models are of vehicles that would have been just about contemporary for the sort of early to mid-70s, but there are several World War II ones as well, and it's actually a couple of those that we start with. So the first one is the Sherman, a tank that kind of really needs no introduction, obviously one of the most widely known tanks of World War II, and straight away you can kind of see what I mean by the sort of metallic colour schemes. This is in a sort of metallic gold colour. I'm guessing it's supposed to be sort of like a desert camouflage. To be fair, compared to some of the later ones, it's not the worst one. It does at least kind of look a bit desertish, I think. Strange that they went for an American star on the side, sorry, an American flag on the side rather than an American star. Weirdly, the box art for this tank does actually feature a star on the side, which is a bit unusual. But you can see from this one, this is kind of like the rest of the Battle Kings tanks all follow this same sort of pattern. So there's kind of not bad detail. It's fairly simple, but there's a bit of detail there with the various tools, engine vents, driver and co-driver hatches, things like that. The chassis, hull, and the movable turret are all metal, but the gun barrel is plastic. It's a bit of a shame on these that, in the case of all the tanks, the gun barrels are plastic. I touched upon it in the video I did on the Matchbox Superfast and the Corgi Juniors military ranges, that they often had sort of plastic gun barrels. You can kind of forgive it a little bit more on those because of the scale. But yeah, it's a shame on these ones that they aren't metal. The tanks also had these rubbery tracks. Most of them were grey, like this one, but there are a couple of models that have black tracks, which we'll come to shortly. And then they all had this same generic commander figure. It actually looks a little bit more like a post-war tank commander to me. But he was there, and he actually revolves as well in his turret. Now, one feature of the tanks is they all had these same little plastic wheels, but despite the kind of fairly basic detail on these, one nice feature of the Sherman is that they actually went to the extent of doing the Sherman's distinctive suspension, and that's all obviously part of the metal base as well. I think because these are sort of fairly sort of simple models, it would have been quite easy for Matchbox just to do a line of normal plastic wheels. It still would have been recognisable as a Sherman, but now I think it's a really nice touch that they actually did that. So the tanks tended to have 3 kind of weak points, and certainly if you're kind of buying these unboxed, these are kind of things to look out for. So the first one is obviously the plastic gun barrel. They do elevate and depress a little bit, but obviously with it being plastic, it's not the strongest and it is quite vulnerable. The Sherman's this is the standard 75mm Sherman, so the Sherman certainly isn't the worst because it doesn't stick out that far, but that's quite a weak point. The second one is the tracks. Although they're pretty tough tracks, I've certainly yet to come across a Battle Kings tank that's got perished or ripped tracks or anything like that. But I had a couple of Battle Kings tanks when I was quite little, and obviously they got played with a lot. And I often found that when you kind of pushed them along the floor on carpet or whatever, the tracks had a tendency to come off, especially when it's a tank like this that has no kind of lower sort of hull plate or anything like that to kind of keep them in place. So yeah, the tracks would have a tendency to come off. And then the other weak point is the commander himself. Very often, unboxed Battle Kings tanks are either missing the commander's head or the entire figure. So yeah, there are some weak points. Other than that, they are pretty tough models. As I say, the rest of them is all metal. So that's the first version of the Sherman. and that was replaced in 1978 by this one. So instantly it looks much better. You can see straight away it's also got exactly the same stickers as the previous one, but it's been done in a nice sort of green and khaki colour scheme. One feature of the later tanks is that although they were in more realistic colour schemes, Matchbox, I don't know, for some reason, seemed to insist on doing them in two colour camouflage schemes, even when a one colour scheme might actually be more accurate. But I have to say, you know, it looks pretty good, and it certainly looks better than the original one. And you can see they've also picked out the suspension in black. Another feature of the later ones, on the early one, you can see what would be the sprocket wheel and the idler wheel are in the sort of tan colour, and then the road wheels are in green. On this one, the wheels are all the same colour. These are the two main variations of the Sherman. There is another version that's got a French flag sticker on the side, but I think that's pretty rare. In terms of variations in general for the Battle Kings tanks and other vehicles, the various sort of colours used for the plastic wheels, there's quite a lot of different variation in the shades and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it's how far do you want to go if you really want to collect them all. I can't say that's ever something that's particularly bothered me. I'm happy with these two variants. Admittedly, if I found the French flag one, I wouldn't mind picking it up. But yeah, I can't say I'm bothered by sort of different shades of green on the plastic wheels or anything like that. So that's both versions of the Sherman tank. And the second one, it's another World War II tank. Unfortunately, it's one that's probably in the worst colour scheme. So it's the King Tiger, and for some reason Matchbox chose to do it in this kind of rather unusual silver scheme. Whether it's because it's a German tank, and German tanks are often seen in a kind of a grey type camouflage, I'm not really sure. I can't say it looks great. This is obviously one of the ones that has black tracks. And as you can see, because it's one of the early ones, it's got the different coloured sprocket wheel and idler wheel. Obviously, the gun barrel's much bigger on this one, so he's kind of more vulnerable. But you've got the German cross there on the side and the tank number 23. But the rear's quite nicely done. You've got, again, all metal, so you've got the sort of rear mud flaps, you've got the exhaust pipes. It's pretty well done, of course, as I say again, the turret turns. Now, this is one I've actually got the box for. So I just thought I'd have a look at one of the boxes. Now, all the vehicles in the range were all in this exact same style box. It's only the size of the box that differed depending on obviously which model it was. So straight away, you know, you can see the sort of classic Matchbox artwork, really sort of eye-catching, really kind of stands out. They all had this sort of Battle Kings logo across the top. That's obviously the individual model number for the King Tiger, and it features the what the tank has, like the revolving elevating gun turret, rubber flex track, tank commander and infantry figures. I'll come to the figures shortly. Then you've got this kind of picture of a tank commander, obviously shouting out some orders. And then all the boxes have this sort of nice painted background and the sort of ground with the tank tracks on it. Then on the back, this is probably the best feature, they all had a really dramatic action-packed picture of the relevant model. And again, it features a smaller picture showing off what the features are of the model. So you can see there you've got a couple of King Tigers smashing their way through a forest. But yeah, really good, really dramatic looking boxes, really action-packed. And I think that, you know, the boxes are absolutely lovely for the Battle Kings range. So yeah, as I mentioned, each of the tanks and a couple of the other vehicles actually came with 3 small soldier figures. Matchbox at the time had quite a big range of toy soldiers. They were pretty well renowned for it. They were very nicely moulded ones, and they had quite a selection. These ones, there were a variety that Matchbox kind of included pretty randomly with the Battle Kings models. So you can actually see in this case, despite the fact they're in the sort of bluey grey colour, which is traditionally reserved for German soldiers, there's actually 2 Americans, and you've got what looks like a post-war British soldier. The colours that the soldiers came in, which soldiers you got with which vehicle is completely random. So obviously, as I say, with having sort of 2 Americans and a British with a German tank, they have absolutely no relation to the vehicle. So again, similar to the variations on the road wheels that I mentioned, the different shades of plastic, I think there's probably a myriad variations of the different combinations of soldiers that you can get. But they're really nice figures. I'm pretty sure they must have been the same moulds that they used in their normal sort of toy soldier range. That would make the vehicles approximately sort of 1/72, 1/76 scale. But yeah, it's a nice feature that you get. I should just point out the cellophane is missing from this box. It would normally be like a proper sort of window box style. So that's the box for the King Tiger. Now, unfortunately, as I say, the second release of the first 10 models tended to be in better colours. I'll just put the King Tiger over there. Unfortunately, the King Tiger suffers again by Matchbox deciding to just overpaint the basic silver finish with some black camouflage. It looks slightly better, I guess, but it's still an unusual colour scheme. It would have looked so much better if they'd done it, even in a sort of green and khaki scheme or something like that. But yeah, I would say, I think the Battle King, the King Tiger itself, is very nicely done. I say it's pretty nicely moulded at the back. But yeah, the colour schemes that Matchbox chose for it kind of let it down rather. So that's the two King Tigers. Now we move on to a vehicle that was very much a contemporary vehicle at the time, and that's the British Army Chieftain tank. So this was the British Army's current main battle tank all throughout the 70s and into the 80s. Very powerful tank for its time, 120mm gun, decent armour, sadly let down by an unreliable power plant. But yeah, still overall a sort of very, very good tank. So Matchbox brought this one out in a kind of rather garish metallic green, and you just got like a sort of British Army style regimental badge on the front there with the number 8 on it. Again, of course, exactly the same commander figure, although at least in this one, the commander kind of looks more at home. So again, it's a nice sort of solid model, but of course you've got the long, thin plastic gun barrel again. So that's the first version of the Chieftain. And then the second version came out in a scheme not too dissimilar to the second version of the Sherman. An unusual scheme for a British Army Chieftain. They tended to be like a green and black camouflage normally, but yeah, certainly looks better than the original version. What you can see again, it's got the same sticker as before. And again, as I say, because it's a later one, all the wheels are in the same colour. Now this is another tank that I've actually got the box for. So here it is, you can see we go, Chieftain. And you can see in this case, it looks like we've got a German soldier, but moulded in green, which tended to be a colour more reserved for British and American soldiers in this sort of scale. And you've got two, looks like you've got same American, I think in fact it might actually be the same two Americans as came with the King Tiger, but again, this time actually moulded in green. So as you can see, pretty random assortment of figures. Now, one thing that Matchbox didn't bother updating was the artwork. So it was the later version of the Chieftain that I got in this box, but as you can see, the artwork still reflects the earlier version. As I say, Matchbox never bothered updating that. But you know, still, it's another action-packed picture that Matchbox have put on the back there, which I think looks really good. So that's the box for the Chieftain. And then the next tank is just about a contemporary tank for the time. It's the American M48, known as the Patton, although Matchbox never called it that, obviously named after General Patton from World War II. This would have just gone out of frontline US Army service by the time the Battle Kings range came out, but it saw a lot of service through the 60s, saw a lot of combat service with the Americans in Vietnam, with the Israelis in the Middle East, and with the Pakistanis in their various battles with the Indian Army. So it's certainly a tank that saw a lot of combat service, unlike the Chieftain, which never actually saw combat with the British Army. So yeah, certainly it's a very widely used tank. It's probably in an even more garish green than the Chieftain. But yeah, and it's just got a sort of simple American star on the front. Again, you've got the long gun barrel, obviously again, turning turret. So that's the first version. Now, this was often listed in catalogues as M48AZ. It's actually a typo. It should be M48A2, which is what it does actually say underneath here. Yeah, M48A2. You see, as I say, Matchbox never actually referred to it as the Patton tank. A2 simply means the second modified version since the original production version came out. Nothing more exciting than that. So yeah, so that's the M48 Patton, first version. And then the second version of the M48 was actually quite an unusual scheme. It's this sort of reddish brown and khaki scheme. And with this one, unusually, compared to those that all kept the same stickers, this one's got a completely different sticker. Still got an American star, but now it says Armoured Div on the front, obviously short Armoured Division. But they have done the American spelling, so a bit of attention to detail there. But yeah, a very unusual scheme. I guess it's supposed to be some kind of a desert scheme. But yeah, that's the second version of the M48. Now, it was actually the M48 that Matchbox chose to go with the tank transporter that was released as part of the range. And there were two versions of the tank transporter, which obviously we'll come to shortly. But although it would have been quite easy for Matchbox to just re-release this one and the bright green one, pleasingly they actually did two completely new versions of the M48 that specifically came with the tank transporter. So yeah, we'll come to those shortly, but for the meantime, that's the second release of the M48. Then we move on to a tank that's really quite an unusual one for Matchbox to do. It's a contemporary tank. It's the American M551 Sheridan. It was a light tank built for reconnaissance purposes and things like that. And it was quite an unusual concept. It was a very lightly built tank. It was aluminium armour. I think it weighed a maximum about 15 tonnes, because one of the provisos when they drew up the kind of requirement for this tank was that it needed to be droppable by parachute, obviously several parachutes. But yeah, it needed to actually be air droppable, so it couldn't be a heavy tank. But whereas previous light tanks had suffered in terms of their armament, this one, although the actual armour is quite thin, this one was actually given armament sufficient so it could take on enemy main battle tanks. But it's a very unusual weapon system it's got. It's actually a combination gun and missile launcher. The missile launcher, it launched a shillelagh anti-tank missile, so that was obviously the part that was meant to take on enemy tanks. And then in the conventional gun roll, it's actually a 152mm caliber gun, which is a really big size gun, certainly for the size of tank. And that fired kind of high explosive and other sorts of rounds. It was quite a problematic tank. Unfortunately, the weapon system itself turned out to be not terribly reliable, certainly the missile launcher version. The tank itself was kind of plagued by a number of difficulties. They were widely used in Vietnam. It was found that they were quite vulnerable to mines and also to rocket-propelled grenades, but they were amphibious. They could swim in water. And one feature of the conventional gun, one of the rounds it could fire was actually what's called a beehive round, which basically acted as like a giant shotgun shell. So it's basically a big canister full of little bits of shrapnel. And they were devastating against North Vietnamese kind of massed infantry attacks. So it did have some success, but yeah, overall the kind of concept was kind of quite flawed, really. The tank, despite all its drawbacks, would actually remain in service for quite a while, simply due to the fact that it was air droppable. It was the only tank that was. So it saw service again in 1989 in Panama, the invasion of Panama. And then it was actually the first type of American tank deployed to the Middle East, ready for Desert Storm in 1991. Didn't see much action there, although I do believe that's the only time it actually fired any of its shillelagh missiles in anger. But yeah, certainly overall, I think you could say that the weapons system wasn't a massive success. And they actually saw out the days posing as Russian vehicles at the US Army's huge national training centre. So it's rather an ignominious end for what was, I suppose, quite a revolutionary tank in some ways, but yeah, unfortunately not one of the most successful. So it's quite an unusual tank, as I say, for Matchbox to do. So this is obviously the later version. Now this model is actually the exact one I've had ever since I was little. So it has seen a fair few carpet-based battles. One feature I didn't point out on the early one is it's actually got these little plastic smoke discharges under the turret, and you can see, unfortunately, on this one of them has broken off. But as I say, it's come through various carpet battles pretty unscathed. And I really like the colour scheme on this one. I think the green and khaki kind of suits it really well. So yeah, very unusual tank, but as I say, it would have been a current one. So that's both versions of the M551 Sheridan. So that's all the tanks that they did as part of the Battle Kings range. The next vehicle, Matchbox just called it the self-propelled 155mm gun. Now, I'd always thought with this that this was just a generic self-propelled gun that Matchbox had kind of made up themselves. Then a while ago, I was kind of looking through a book and I came across a picture of a self-propelled gun, and it was like, hang on, that looks very similar to the Battle Kings model. Obviously had a quick look, and indeed, it clearly was the same vehicle. So it's actually, and this is a pretty obscure one, it's actually a French Mark F3 self-propelled 155mm gun. So yeah, a really unusual vehicle for Matchbox to pick. This, as can be seen, is the other one that's got the black tracks. Now, despite this being one of the earlier releases, the colour scheme that it was released in isn't one of the worst. It is at least kind of a more army-type green. Why Matchbox felt the need to do the gun cradle in metallic gold, I'm not really sure. Another good thing, because the gun is a larger calibre than any of the tank guns would be, the gun barrel is actually all metal. and it sort of elevates up to a sort of decent height like a howitzer should. It's got obviously very limited traverse, again, like a howitzer would. So yeah, a really odd vehicle for Matchbox to pick. It's not like the real vehicle was a particularly successful one. It saw service in quite a few numbers, both not only with the French army, but with quite a few other countries as well. But it's quite a small vehicle, and it actually only had room for the commander and the driver. The rest of the crew and the ammunition had to travel separately in an armoured personnel carrier. So yeah, not a sort of terribly sort of successful vehicle really. But it certainly is no denying when you look at a picture of one, it's certainly the same vehicle. So that's the early version of that. I'll start a new row with that one. And then the second version isn't actually hugely different because the green that they chose for the first one wasn't terrible to begin with. But you can see this one's kind of more of a matte finish, and obviously they've done the gun cradle in green as well. But yeah, it's the same sticker, same black tracks. And this is another one that I've actually got the box for, which is here. And this one appears to come with a kneeling American, a German officer, and a German throwing a stick grenade, but all moulded this time in a sort of khaki scheme. So as I say, it just shows how random the figures actually were. So we'll have a look at the artwork on the back. You can see even on the artwork they even did the metallic gold gun cradle. It obviously shows the feature, shows how high the gun elevates. But yeah, so that's the box for the self-propelled howitzer. I actually forgot to show you the box for the M48. I'll just show it just for completeness' sake. This is actually the early model M48 that I've got the box for. Unfortunately, two of the soldiers are missing from this one, so I've got what looks like a marching British soldier, or maybe he's about to club someone over the head with his gun. Again, in sort of that one's moulded in the sort of olive green. And then the picture on the back, there we go, another nice dramatic picture. And that's the box for the M48. So yeah, sorry about that, just missed that one out before. So that's all the tracked vehicles that kind of came out as part of the first range. Then we move on to half tracks. And in this case, the American M3A1 half track. So we're jumping back to World War II with this one. It's the standard US Army armoured personnel carrier. And I have to say, it's a pretty nice model of it, despite the colour. The green, again, is, yeah, not great. And it's almost what's obviously supposed to be the canvas tilt over the top. It does come off, by the way. There we go, so you can look inside. Thankfully, that's not a bad colour. But yeah, this is almost orange in colour. Now with the half track, because they chose the A1 version, which is the version that has this armoured ring mount here, they chose a different figure, and they've actually done a really nicely moulded World War II American soldier with a 50 caliber, which is what these tended to be armed with. So it's really nice that they kind of chose to do that and didn't just put the generic figure in there again. Nice big invasion star on the bonnet, obviously entirely appropriate for this vehicle, and a couple more, one on each side. I suppose one criticism of it is that they have, in this case, unlike with the Sherman where they could have simplified the suspension but didn't, on this one they have. The ironic thing is, back in the late 50s when Matchbox Lesney brought out their military range, they did an M3 half track as part of that, and it's about, well, I would say half the size at the most of this, and yet they did manage to kind of pretty well replicate the quite distinctive suspension that these have. Obviously, in this case, Matchbox have just kind of decided to do it nice and simple with some road wheels. But to be honest, it doesn't look bad. I really like this one, and the rest of the detail's pretty good. And see, in this case, it's got the winch, the big bumper with the winch on the front. It's got the armoured cover that would cover up the windscreen. The armoured covers for the side windows are actually moulded in place. So the detail's pretty good on this one. You've got the jerry can holders on each side and that. So yeah, that's a nice one. And I think the re-released version of that, which of course is in a much better colour scheme, is actually my favourite vehicle from the entire range. The M3 half track, it's my absolute favourite military vehicle, and this specific version with the armoured sort of machine gun mount is my specific favourite variant as well. So I'm really pleased that Matchbox decided to do that. Probably would have been quite simple for them to do, or simpler for them to do just a basic one without that. But yeah, really nice touch that. It looks good with the black bumper, the blacked out wheels and tracks, and of course again with this one, the top comes off, so you've got like a nicely coloured in troop compartment in the back, 10 seats, which the real one would have. So yeah, that's definitely my favourite vehicle from the range. There's quite a few vehicles from the range I particularly like. The Sherman's one I particularly like. But yeah, that's definitely my favourite, and it's another one that I have the box for. So this one seems to come with, looks like a kneeling American. And again, it's the German officer and the German with the stick grenade. And again, they're all moulded in a sort of olive green. And as I mentioned earlier, although again, it's the later version of the half track that was in the box. It's the earlier type artwork that's on the back. It's always like that particular artwork with a couple of half tracks thundering through a ruined town. But yes, that's the box for the M3A1 half track. The last few vehicles that were part of this first release of models for the Battle Kings range aren't the better ones, I'd have to say. The first one is this. It's the recovery vehicle. Now, I can kind of see what Matchbox were going for with this, with the kind of the rear end looks very reminiscent of a Scammell Explorer, which was a 1950s era heavy recovery vehicle used by the British Army. So I'm guessing Matchbox's idea was to kind of do that, but obviously give it a much more modern, I'd say futuristic looking cab in this case. I'm not totally convinced by the cab on this one. I think it just looks a bit too futuristic, really. I mean, the colours obviously aren't great, but I mean, that's obviously the same for quite a few of the early models. So it's a very chunky model, it's fair to say. This model also appeared in the Super Kings range in like a red and white scheme. And the same cab and chassis was also used for a dumper truck, again in the Super Kings range. But yeah, so you've got the boom does raise up, and you've got these sort of twin hooks at the back, just moulded in red plastic. But yeah, bit of an unusual one, and that's Matchbox did tend to like to kind of create their own vehicles, and this is definitely one of those. So I'll just pop that there. And the re-released version, obviously, it does look better because it's first of all it's in this nice army green. The wheels are in the sort of black plastic. But again, it's still overall, it's an odd looking vehicle. Unusually with this one, not only is the colour different, but they've actually changed it to a single hook. Whether that was found to not be terribly effective or whether it was just cheaper to issue it with one hook, I don't know. But yeah, it's certainly, as I say, a nice sort of chunky model, but just not one of my favourites. And that's another one that I also have the box for. Now, these vehicles didn't come with any figures. Quite a few of the sort of non-tank and armoured related vehicles, they didn't come with any figures at all. And you can see in this case, not only do they show a picture of the model, you've got sort of various other models from the range as well there. So that's the box for the recovery vehicle. And then in a similar vein, we have the tank transporter. So you can see, although it's clearly a different casting, because it's only got 4 wheels and it's got like a double cab, clearly it's supposed to be the same type vehicle. So this is the tank transporter. Obviously, this is the early version of it. It does separate. It's a very sort of quite short looking cab, really. Obviously, Matchbox decided to do the 5th wheel coupling in red plastic. Got air horns on top of the cab there, sort of nice gold plated interior. Quite unusual, couple of smokestacks at the back. The trailer, I actually thought this one was one that would have been used quite a few times as part of the Super Kings range, but it does actually say tank transporter underneath it. And to be fair, most of the other low loader trailers that have been used in various other Super Kings models don't have these folding plastic ramps at the back. So I think this is a trailer that's unique to the Battle Kings range. So again, to give it a bit more colour, Matchbox have done the folding ramps in red plastic. But the trailer is all, apart from the ramps, is all metal. I'll just reattach that to the truck. And as I say, Matchbox decided to choose the M48 as the tank that went with it. And this was the one that came with the early release. Now, weirdly, it's got the same sticker as the later release of the single one we looked at before. But as you can see, although it's still in kind of a metallic-y sort of colour scheme, it looks much better than the bright green one that came out before. Let's move the turret round. There we go. So I think in both cases, actually, the M48s that came with the transporters actually look better than their kind of single counterparts. So yeah, so that's the first. That's the first version of the tank transporter. So I'll just move that over there. And then the second version of the tank transporter, looking much better in this sort of olive type green with the blacked out wheels. In this case, obviously the 5th wheel coupling on the cab is nicely done in black plastic. So it does look much better. Surprised that they didn't bother to do this bit on the bonnet in black plastic as well, but I'm guessing it must be part of the interior moulding, which is done in silver in this case. So that's the cab. And then, again, with the trailer, black plastic wheels, and the ramps again, this time done in black plastic, which obviously looks much better. And this is the version of the M48 that came with it. And I think it's actually my favourite version of all the M48s. It's in a very similar camouflage to the second version of the Chieftain. But yeah, I think it looks really good in this kind of green and khaki scheme. So yeah, so that's the second version of the tank transporter. Let's move that over there. And then the last vehicle released in the initial 10 was this one, which was Matchbox just called it the Hover Raider. It was a conversion of an existing Super Kings range, so the actual basic vehicle is a real one. It's an SRN6 Hovercraft. Now, as I touched upon in my Dinky Boats video, as Dinky did a military version of one of these Hovercraft, it is a vessel that the British Army genuinely used, but they didn't tend to slap great big missiles on the side like this one's got. They tended just to have like a small machine gun at the front. So although the basic vehicle is real, the kind of concept, if you like, is kind of more fantasy. But yes, this is the early version in the sort of same metallic green that Matchbox seem to be quite fond of, with the chrome-plated missiles, spotlight, propeller. Now this one should have a working feature in that when you push it along, both the radar scanner and the propeller rotate. Unfortunately, on this one, admittedly it was bought quite cheap, it doesn't seem to be working, so there must be something loose on the inside. So, but luckily, on the second one, you can see this is the later version, a much better looking olive green, and all the chrome bits on the early one are now done in black plastic, which looks much better. But yeah, on this one, just move that out of the way, you can see the radar scanner does go around, and the propeller rotates as well. Not terribly well, I have to say. Might be the surface. Oh, there you go. You can see it's going around a bit better there. So yeah, so that's the second version of the Hover Raider Hovercraft. So yeah, the last few models, part of the kind of initial 10 that came out, aren't the best ones, but overall, as I say, it must have been successful enough for Matchbox to decide they want to do the first 10 in new colours, and then, as I say, some extra models as well. So what I'll do is I'll leave it there for now, and then in part 2 we'll have a look at the remaining 8 models from the Battle Kings range, and I'll also have a look at what became of some of the castings after Matchbox had finished with them. But in the meantime, please do like, share, subscribe and comment, and I'll see you all very soon. Bye.